She stood at the altar in chains of woven light, a princess of the stars traded to a dirt-covered ape. They told her humanity was broken, weak, a dying race fit only for servitude. They were wrong, and the empire that sold her was about to burn for it. The sky over the Colorado exclusion zone was the color of bruised iron. Genevieve watched it churn through the viewport of the descent shuttle, her reflection ghostly against the reinforced glass. She wore the traditional white silk of an ascendancy bride, but the ceremonial collar around her neck hummed with a low, oppressive frequency, a neural dampener. It was a stark reminder that this was not a wedding. It was an execution of her lineage. The Veyron ascendancy had ruled the Sol system for 3 centuries. They were the descendants of Earth's ancient elite who had fled to the stars, genetically modifying themselves into tall, flawless, ageless beings. When they finally returned, they didn't come as brothers. They came as gods. Earth, left to choke on the ashes of forgotten wars, was swiftly subjugated. The dirt-born humans were reduced to cheap labor, mechanics, and farmers, paying tithes to their golden cousins in the sky. Genevieve belonged to the House of Laurent. For centuries, her family had been the political rivals of the ruling sovereign, pushing for reforms, pushing for leniency toward the dirt-born. When her father's rebellion was crushed, the sovereign didn't just execute him. He chose a punishment designed to shatter the Laurent name forever. Genevieve, the pristine, highly educated daughter of the stars, was to be married off to a random, dirt-born laborer. A beast of the mud. Try to look somewhat grateful, Genevieve. A voice drawled from the shuttle's plush leather seating. Dominic, the sovereign's regional overseer, swirled a glass of synthetic wine, his flawless, aristocratic features twisted in a cruel smirk. The man you are being given to is a mechanic, a grease monkey who fixes atmospheric scrubbers. You will live in his hovel. You will bear his primitive children, and the entire ascendancy will watch your broadcasted degradation. Genevieve kept her eyes on the gray clouds. My father died standing, Dominic. You only stand when the sovereign pulls your strings. Dominic's smirk vanished. He set the glass down, the soft chime of crystal loud in the quiet cabin. We will see how sharp that tongue is after 6 months in the dirt. The shuttle touched down with a heavy thud, venting localized gravity fields that kicked up a storm of toxic red dust. The ramp lowered into the howling wind of Outpost 7. The settlement was a miserable collection of rust-streaked hab blocks, corrugated metal roofs, and towering, belching atmospheric processors that tried, and mostly failed, to clean the poisoned air. A crowd of dirt-born had been gathered by the Ascendancy enforcers. They looked exhausted, their clothes stained with oil and soil, their faces hollowed out by hard labor and meager rations. But, as Genevieve was marched down the ramp by heavily armored guards, she noticed something in their eyes. It wasn't the cowed reverence the Ascendancy propaganda claimed. It was a cold, simmering resentment. Waiting at the end of the landing pad was the man. His file said his name was Arthur Hayes. He was 32, though the weathering around his eyes made him look older. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and dressed in a faded canvas jacket and heavy work boots. His hands were thick, stained with grease that no soap could ever fully wash away. He didn't look like a beast, but he looked entirely, undeniably times human, flawed, scarred, real. Dominic stepped up to the makeshift podium, signaling for the broadcast drones to hover closer. Their red recording lights blinked, transmitting the humiliation to billions across the system. Citizens of Earth, Dominic projected, his voice amplified by the drones. By the grace of the Sovereign, we offer a bridge between the stars and the dirt. The traitorous House of Laurent is hereby dissolved, its final heir given to this. Dominic gestured to Arthur with deep disgust. Man, may she learn the humility her father lacked. Genevieve felt the neural dampener pulse, forcing her to her knees. It was a neat trick the Ascendancy always ensured their victims looked submissive. She bit her lip until she tasted copper, furious tears burning the corners of her eyes. Dominic looked at Arthur. Take her chain, human. She is your property now. Do with her as you please. Arthur didn't move immediately. He looked at Dominic, his dark eyes entirely unreadable. Then he looked down at Genevieve. He didn't reach for the ceremonial chain of light that bound her wrists. Instead, he stepped forward, knelt in the red dust, and reached for the neural dampener around her neck. Hey, Dominic snapped. The collar stays on. Arthur ignored him. His thick, grease-stained fingers found the microscopic biometric clasp at the back of her neck. To Genevieve's absolute shock, Arthur didn't just fumble with it. He moved with the precision of a master engineer. A sharp click times echoed. The collar hissed, powered down, and fell into the dust. Genevieve gasped, suddenly able to breathe, the crushing weight lifting from her mind. The enforcers leveled their plasma rifles. Dominic's face went pale with fury. You primitive ape, I gave you no permission to. Arthur stood up, offering his hand to Genevieve. He looked back at Dominic, his voice a deep, gravelly baritone that easily cut through the howling wind. The marriage contract stated, I take her as my wife. In my house, my wife doesn't wear a leash. If the sovereign has a problem with my interpretation of the contract, he can come down here and discuss it with me. A ripple of low, dangerous murmurs moved through the crowd of humans. The enforcers gripped their weapons tighter, looking nervously at the sheer numbers surrounding them. Dominic glared at Arthur, calculating the risk. The broadcast was live. A massacre at a highly publicized wedding would make the sovereign look weak, unable to control a single dirt town. You will regret that, Hayes, Dominic sneered. Enjoy the filth. Arthur pulled Genevieve to her feet. His grip was strong, but surprisingly gentle. Let's go home, he said quietly. Genevieve expected a hovel. She expected rats, leaking roofs, and the smell of rot. The ascendancy taught that humans lived like feral animals, entirely dependent on the technology dropped down to them from the orbital rings. Arthur's home was different. It was built into the side of a massive, hollowed-out, subterranean cooling tower from the old world. When he closed the heavy steel door behind them, the howling of the wind vanished, replaced by the hum of a pristine, heavily modified geothermal generator. The interior was warm, lit by soft amber lighting. The floors were swept clean, the furniture was hand-carved wood, a luxury practically unheard of on the dead surface of Earth, and there were actual shelves lined with physical paper books. Genevieve stood awkwardly in the center of the living area, rubbing her wrists where the light chains had been. She waited for the other shoe to drop. She waited for Arthur to turn around, puff out his chest, and demand her submission. She was a prize, an alien beauty handed over to a man who had likely never seen the inside of a proper medical facility. Arthur walked into the small kitchen, took off his heavy jacket, and began washing his hands. The water is heated, he said, not looking back. First door on the left is the washroom. There are clean clothes on the bed. They're mine, so they'll be big, but they're clean. You can take the bedroom. I'll sleep out here. Genevieve blinked, her mind struggling to process the lack of hostility. You're giving me the bed? Arthur dried his hands on a towel and turned to look at her. You've had a long day. You were used as a prop in front of the whole system. You need rest, but Dominic said. Dominic is an arrogant idiot who doesn't know how to survive without a gravity couch and a servant droid, Arthur interrupted gently. He walked over to a small stove and struck a match, lighting a real gas burner. I don't care what he said. You're safe here, Genevieve. It was the first time I'd heard her name without spitting it like a curse in weeks. The sudden, unexpected kindness broke something inside her. She didn't weep, but she hurried into the washroom and locked the door, leaning against it as she caught her breath. Over the next few weeks, the tension slowly unspooled, though the mystery of Arthur Hayes only deepened. He left early every morning to work on the atmospheric processors, returning covered in grime, but always carrying small, seemingly useless pieces of scrap metal. Genevieve, refusing to be a parasite, started cleaning the house and preparing their rations. She learned that human food, while lacking the synthetic perfection of ascendancy cuisine, had a hearty, grounding soul to it. One evening, as Arthur ate the stew she had made, she finally asked the question that had been burning in her mind. Why are you not angry? She asked, sitting across from him at the wooden table. Arthur paused, his spoon halfway to his mouth. At you? At my people, she clarified. The ascendancy enslaved Earth. We strip mine your oceans. We force you into grueling labor. And they handed me to you as an insult. By all rights, you should hate me. You should be making me suffer. Arthur set the spoon down. He looked at his heavily scarred hands. I fought in the Chicago uprising 10 years ago, he said quietly. Genevieve froze. The Chicago uprising was a slaughter. The ascendancy had glassed half the continent to put down the rebellion. You were there? I was a combat engineer, Arthur replied, meeting her eyes. There was no boast in his voice, only a heavy, immovable grief. I watched my brother get vaporized by an orbital strike. I watched friends starve in the sieges. I know what the Ascendancy is capable of. He leaned forward slightly. But I also know who you are, Genevieve Laurent. She stiffened. What do you mean? Your father smuggled medical supplies to the resistance during the uprising. He used his merchant ships to bypass the blockades. We knew House Laurent was sympathetic. We knew you were trying to change the system from the inside. Arthur gave a small, sad smile. When Dominic announced he was giving you to a dirtborn to humiliate you, the local foreman rigged the lottery. We made sure it was me. Genevieve's breath hitched. You chose to marry me? I chose to protect the daughter of the man who tried to save my brother, Arthur corrected gently. You're not a prisoner here, Genevieve. You're under asylum. The entire settlement is keeping an eye out for you. The realization hit her like a physical blow. The humans weren't broken. They were organized. They were waiting. Arthur, she whispered, her eyes wide. What are those pieces of scrap you bring home every night? Arthur held her gaze for a long moment. Then he stood up and walked to the rug in the center of the room. He pulled it back, revealing a heavy steel hatch in the floor. He punched a code into a hidden keypad, and the hatch hissed open, revealing a stairwell leading down into the dark. Come with me, he said. Genevieve followed him down into the sub-basement. When Arthur flipped the lights on, she gasped. It wasn't a storage cellar. It was a high-tech laboratory. Desks were covered in holographic blueprints. Racks of Ascendancy plasma weaponry, heavily modified and upgraded, lined the walls. But the centerpiece of the room was a massive, humming, cylindrical device connected to a web of thick cables. The Ascendancy thinks we're too stupid to understand their tech, Arthur said, walking up to the device and running a hand along its metallic casing. They think because we live in the dirt, we've forgotten how to reach the sky. What is this? She asked, her voice trembling. It's a localized orbital tether hack, Arthur explained. The Ascendancy controls Earth via the orbital defense grid. If anyone tries to fly an unsanctioned ship, the grid shoots them down. This machine, it can blind the grid. For about 20 minutes. Long enough for a fleet of modified cargo haulers to get into orbit. Genevieve stared at him, horrified and awed. You're building an invasion force. We're building an evacuation, Arthur said firmly. There's a habitable moon, 2 systems over, that the Ascendancy hasn't surveyed. We've been secretly retrofitting the mining haulers for deep space travel. But we needed the grid access codes. The biometrics of a high-ranking Ascendancy official. He looked at her, and the final piece of the puzzle clicked into place. My DNA, Genevieve whispered. My retina scans. I'm a Laurent. I have legacy access to the grid. We were never going to force you, Arthur said, his voice deadly serious. If you want to live out your days here in peace, I will protect you. But if you want to finish what your father started, if you want to strike a blow that the sovereign will feel for 1,000 years, Genevieve looked at the array, then at Arthur. For her entire life, she had been a pawn, a bargaining chip for her father, a plaything for the sovereign, a victim for Dominic. She walked up to the terminal and placed her hand on the biometric scanner. Tell me what you need me to do. 6 months. That was the mandated time before the Ascendancy returned to check on the progress of their punitive marriages. The day the shuttle breached the atmosphere, Outpost 7 was ready. Genevieve stood next to Arthur in the center of the settlement. She no longer wore the pristine white silk of her arrival. She wore rugged canvas, heavily insulated boots, and a thick jacket. Her pristine hair was tied back, and there was a streak of engine grease on her cheek. She didn't look like an Ascendancy princess anymore. She looked like a survivor. The shuttle landed, blowing dust over the crowd of silent, watching humans. The ramp lowered, and Dominic stepped out, flanked by a dozen heavily armed enforcers. He wore a crisp, immaculate uniform, a stark contrast to the grit of the world around him. Dominic's eyes scanned the crowd, finally landing on Genevieve. He stopped, his sneer faltering for a fraction of a second. He had expected to find her emaciated, crying, begging to be taken back to the orbital rings. Instead, she stood tall, her chin raised, her arm brushing against Arthur's in a display of quiet solidarity. Well, Dominic said, recovering his composure as he swaggered down the ramp, It seems the mud has stained the silk. Look at you, Laurent. A common dirt pig. It's Hayes now, Genevieve said, her voice carrying clearly across the silent square. Dominic stopped. He laughed, a harsh barking sound. Oh, that is precious. The Stockholm Syndrome has set in. I suppose when you're forced to sleep in a sty, you start to love the swine. He turned his attention to Arthur. I'm here for the quarterly tithe, Hayes, and I'm here for the broadcast. I want a live feed of her cleaning my boots. Arthur didn't move. He stood with his feet planted shoulder-width apart, his hands resting loosely at his sides. The tithe isn't ready, and my wife doesn't clean boots. The silence that followed was deafening. The wind itself seemed to stop blowing. Dominic's eyes narrowed into slits. Excuse me? You heard me, Arthur said, his voice entirely devoid of fear. There is no tithe. There is no broadcast. Earth is closed. Dominic's face flushed with violent rage. He drew his plasma pistol in a blur of motion, pointing it directly at Arthur's chest. The 12 enforcers behind him raised their rifles, targeting the crowd. You ignorant, suicidal ape, Dominic spat. I will burn this entire settlement to the bedrock. I will execute you, and then I will give her to the rest of the outpost as a lesson in... Click. Arthur pressed a small detonator hidden in the pocket of his jacket. He didn't blow anything up. Instead, a massive, invisible shockwave pulsed from the sub-basement of his home. It rippled through the outpost, washing over the Ascendancy shuttle and the enforcers. Instantly, the humming lights on Dominic's plasma pistol died. The enforcers' rifles powered down with a pathetic whine. The hovering broadcast drones dropped out of the sky like dead birds, shattering against the hard earth. The localized shield generators on their armor flickered and vanished. An electromagnetic pulse, modified to bypass Ascendancy shielding. Dominic stared at his dead weapon in shock. He pulled the trigger frantically. Nothing happened. What did you do? Dominic demanded, stepping back as the realization of his vulnerability hit him. I leveled the playing field, Arthur said, taking a slow, deliberate step forward. The crowd of humans didn't shout. They didn't scream. They simply stepped forward, moving as a single, coordinated entity. Every mechanic, every miner, every farmer produced a weapon. Iron pipes, heavy mining lasers, projectile kinetics that didn't rely on microchips. Kill them! Dominic shrieked at his enforcers. The enforcers hesitated. They were used to fighting with overwhelming technological superiority. Now, they were just men in heavy, unpowered armor, surrounded by hundreds of hardened survivors who had spent their entire lives breaking rocks and carrying iron. Arthur didn't give Dominic time to think. He closed the distance between them with terrifying speed. Dominic, trained in elite Ascendancy martial arts, threw a desperate, perfect punch aimed at Arthur's throat. Arthur took the hit. It snapped his head back, splitting his lip, but he didn't even stagger. Human bone density, forged in the heavy gravity and brutal conditions of Earth, was vastly superior to the pampered, low-gravity physiology of the Ascendancy elite. Before Dominic could pull his arm back, Arthur grabbed him by the throat. With a roar of raw, pent-up fury, Arthur lifted the overseer completely off the ground and slammed him down onto the hood of a rusted atmospheric processor. The metal buckled under Dominic's spine. The air left the overseer's lungs in a pathetic wheeze. The enforcers dropped their useless weapons, raising their hands in immediate surrender as the Dirtborn swarmed them, stripping them of their armor in seconds. Arthur leaned over Dominic, his shadow falling across the terrified man's face. You thought you broke us, Arthur growled, his voice a low rumble of thunder. You thought because we submitted, we surrendered. You mistook patience for weakness. Dominic choked, his eyes wide with genuine terror. The Sovereign, the orbital grid. He'll glass this continent. The grid is blind, Genevieve's voice rang out. She stepped up beside Arthur, looking down at the man who had tormented her. She held up a small, blinking datapad. I authorized a system-wide diagnostic loop using my family's legacy codes. Your orbital guns are offline, and by the time they reboot, the mining fleet will be outside the gravity well. Dominic looked at her, his mind shattering as he realized what had happened. You traitor! I am Genevieve Laurent, she said coldly, and I am exactly where I belong. Arthur hauled Dominic to his feet and shoved him violently toward the ramp of the grounded, powerless shuttle. Take your men, get in that metal coffin, and wait for your sovereign to tow you back to orbit, Arthur ordered. Tell him that Earth is no longer his farm. Tell him that the apes have learned how to bite. As Dominic and his stripped, humiliated guards crawled into the dark shuttle, the humans of Outpost 7 let out a deafening, unified roar of triumph. It was a sound that shook the dust from the rooftops, the sound of a species remembering how to roar. Arthur turned to Genevieve. He wiped the blood from his lip, breathing heavily, and for the first time since she had met him, he gave her a full, genuine smile. "The fleet is ready," Arthur said. "It's time to go." Genevieve reached out and took his grease-stained, bloodied hand in hers. "Lead the way, husband." The ground beneath Outpost 7 did not just shake, it ruptured. For decades, the Ascendancy believed the massive subterranean tremors recorded across the North American continent were simply the dying gasps of Earth's unstable tectonic plates. They were wrong. The tremors were the sound of industry. Hidden miles beneath the irradiated surface, human engineers had been cannibalizing the old world to build the keys to the new one. As Arthur and Genevieve sprinted toward the entrance of the underground hangar, the settlement around them transformed. The rusted atmospheric processors that the Ascendancy mocked as primitive junk suddenly folded outward, revealing themselves to be colossal exhaust vents. The Earth groaned as massive blast doors, disguised as canyon floors, began to retract, swallowing the toxic red dust into the abyss below. "We have a 20-minute window before the diagnostic loop finishes and the orbital grid comes back online," Genevieve yelled over the deafening roar of grinding metal. Arthur held her hand tightly, pulling her through the throngs of running colonists. "It's enough! Thomas has the fleet prepped for immediate burn. We just need to get to the Times Leviathan." They reached the edge of the hangar bay, and Genevieve's breath caught in her throat. Descending into the cavernous depths, she saw the culmination of human defiance. A fleet of 30 massive, retrofitted cargo haulers sat upon heavy launch cradles. They were ugly, brutalist monstrosities of engineering-welded plates of thick titanium, exposed hydraulic lines, and massive chemical thrusters. They completely lacked the sleek, aerodynamic elegance of Ascendancy starcruisers, but to Genevieve, they were the most beautiful ships she had ever seen. They were built for survival. Arthur led her up the boarding ramp of the flagship, the Times Leviathan, where a grizzled man with a mechanical prosthetic arm was already barking orders into a comlink. This was Commander Thomas Wyatt, a veteran of the old resource wars and the tactical mind behind the evacuation. "Arthur!" Thomas roared, his eyes lighting up as they entered the cramped, utilitarian bridge. "We felt the EMP up top. Tell me we are clear to fly." "Genevieve bought us the time," Arthur said, strapping himself into the pilot's seat. He gestured to the co-pilot chair. "Take tactical, Genevieve. I need you to monitor the orbital defense grid." Genevieve sank into the worn leather seat, her fingers flying across the crude physical keyboards. It was a stark contrast to the holographic, thought-responsive interfaces she had grown up with, but there was a satisfying certainty in the heavy times, clack times of the keys. "All ships, this is the Times Leviathan," Arthur's voice boomed over the fleet-wide channel. "Ignition sequence on my mark. Leave nothing behind but the dust. 3, 2, 1. Burn." The roar of 30 synchronized chemical rockets was biblical. The Times Leviathan Times shuddered violently as the immense G-force slammed Genevieve back into her seat. The screens flashed red as the fleet clawed its way out of the subterranean silos, bursting through the surface of Earth like a swarm of angry hornets emerging from a kicked nest. Outside the viewport, the bruised iron sky was torn apart by trails of blazing orange exhaust. "Atmospheric breach in 2 minutes," Sarah Jenkins, the ship's chief engineer, called out from the engineering bay below them. "Hull integrity holding at 92%. "These old birds are heavy, Arthur." "Keep the throttles wide open, Sarah," Arthur ordered, his hands gripping the mechanical flight yoke with white-knuckled intensity. Genevieve watched the radar screen, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. The orbital defense grid, a vast network of automated plasma cannons designed to vaporize any unsanctioned vessel, showed up as thousands of inactive green dots. Her family's legacy codes had forced them into a deep diagnostic slumber. They were going to make it. They were actually going to break the cage. Then the console let out a piercing, high-pitched scream. Genevieve's blood ran cold. The green dots on her screen were rapidly turning hostile red. "Arthur!" she shouted, panic creeping into her voice. "The grid! It's waking up!" "Impossible!" Thomas snapped, leaning over her console. "You said we had 20 minutes! It hasn't even been 5!" Genevieve frantically typed commands, trying to reinitiate the loop, but the system locked her out. "Someone is overriding my codes from the outside!" Brute forcing the system. "The Sovereign. He must have a master decryption key." "It's not the Sovereign," Arthur said, his voice dropping to a dangerous, icy register. He pointed out the viewport. There, dropping out of slipspace directly above the atmospheric boundary, was a ship that blotted out the stars. It was a Sovereign-class dreadnought, the Times Aegis. It was a floating fortress of polished gold and white energy shields, bristling with heavy plasma artillery, and it was positioned perfectly to block their escape trajectory. "They didn't just find out about us," Thomas whispered, his face going pale. "They knew. They were waiting." Genevieve's mind raced, piecing the horrible truth together. "The marriage," she gasped. "The broadcast. It wasn't just to humiliate me. Emperor Valerius knew there were resistance cells surviving underground. He used me as bait. He knew the humans of Outpost 7 would intervene to save a Laurent, exposing the entire underground network. He let us build the fleet so he could draw us all out into the open and execute us in one stroke." "Incoming transmission from the Times Aegis," Sarah reported, her voice trembling. The main view screen flickered, replacing the image of the dreadnought with the cold, flawlessly sculpted face of Emperor Valerius. He sat upon a throne of synthesized quartz, looking at them with the detached curiosity of a scientist observing insects in a jar. "Genevieve Laurent," the Emperor mused, his voice echoing through the bridge. "I must confess, I am impressed. I expected the apes to throw rocks. I did not expect them to build ships. You have played your part beautifully." Every rat has scurried out of the sewers directly into the light. Genevieve glared at the screen, her terror giving way to a sudden, burning rage. "You used my father's memory. You used my life just to flush out mechanics and farmers. Do not insult me by pretending they are innocent," Valerius replied smoothly. "They are a blight. And now I will purge this system of the human infection once and for all." "Say your goodbyes to your pet Dirtborn, Genevieve. It ends here." The transmission cut out. "The Times, Aegis Times, is charging main weapons," Genevieve yelled, watching the massive energy spikes on her sensors. "The orbital grid is fully active. They have a firing lock on the Times Magellan Times and the Times Armstrong." "Evasive maneuvers," Thomas roared. "We're cargo ships, Thomas. We can't outfly plasma cannons," Arthur shot back, his eyes darting across the instrument panels. "Genevieve, you have legacy access, even if you can't shut the grid down. Can you change its targeting parameters?" "The encryption is too tight. Valerius locked me out of the mainframes," she replied frantically. "Don't attack the mainframe," Arthur shouted, an unhinged, wild glint in his eyes. "Human engineering, Genevieve! Don't go through the front door. Smash a window. Override the IFF transponders on our Times ships. Make the grid think Times we. Times are the ascendancy, and the Times Aegis Times is the enemy." Genevieve stared at him. It was a brilliant, insane, utterly reckless idea. The ascendancy systems were built on absolute hierarchy. They never accounted for the possibility of their own defense grids being spoofed by physical hardware hacks. "I need 3 minutes!" she cried, pulling up the raw code of their transponders. "I'll buy you 3 minutes," Arthur growled. He slammed his hand down on the fleet-wide comms. "All ships, this is Arthur. Form up behind the Times Leviathan. We're going to play a game of chicken with a god." Arthur pushed the heavy throttles to their absolute physical limits. The Times Leviathan, a brick of solid titanium, surged forward, accelerating directly toward the shimmering golden hull of the Times Aegis. Behind them, the 29 other human ships fell into a tight diamond formation. They were entirely unshielded. One direct hit from the orbital grid or the dreadnought would vaporize them instantly. "Warning! Target lock detected," the ship's automated voice chimed. Through the viewport, Genevieve saw the massive plasma cannons of the Times, Aegis Times glowing with blinding blue light. They were preparing to fire a volley that would wipe the entire human race from the stars. Genevieve! Arthur yelled, wrestling with the controls as the ship rattled violently. Almost there. Her fingers bled as she typed, desperately rewriting the archaic identification protocols of the orbital grid. She took her own biometric signature, the genetic code of the House of Laurent, and broadcasted it across the human fleet. I'm broadcasting my DNA sequence to the transponders. We are no longer human cargo ships. As far as the grid is concerned, we are an escort fleet for the Sovereign. Incoming fire! Thomas screamed. Massive bolts of blue plasma erupted from the Times Aegis, tearing through the vacuum of space straight toward the Times Leviathan. Now, Genevieve. Do it now. Genevieve hit the execution key. Enter. Instantly, the entire orbital defense grid, thousands of automated satellites, heavily armed with kinetic drivers and laser batteries, recalibrated. The sensors read the human fleet as friendly ascendancy vessels. But the Times Aegis, which had just fired upon the friendly vessels, was immediately flagged as a hostile target, violating the protectorate space. The plasma bolts from the Times Aegis times were milliseconds away from striking the Times Leviathan times when the orbital grid intervened. Thousands of automated defensive shields deployed in front of the human fleet, catching the deadly plasma fire. The impact shook the Times, Leviathan times so violently that Genevieve was nearly thrown from her seat, but the thick titanium hull held. Targeting parameters updated. The cold, mechanical voice of the orbital grid broadcasted on open frequencies. Hostile dreadnought detected. Initiating countermeasures. Aboard the Times Aegis, Emperor Valerius watched in absolute horror as his own planetary defense grid turned its weapons upon his flagship. "What is happening?" Valerius shrieked at his bridge crew, his flawless composure shattering. "Why is the grid targeting us? Shut it down!" "We can't, my lord," a terrified ascendancy officer replied. "The grid is registering us as a hostile rebel vessel attacking the Sovereign escort fleet. It's firing." The dark void of space was suddenly illuminated by thousands of streaks of kinetic fire. The Earth's defense grid unleashed a barrage of devastating firepower directly into the Times Aegis. The dreadnought's golden energy shields flared brilliantly, rippling under the immense kinetic bombardment. But the grid was designed to repel massive armadas, not a single ship. Within seconds, the shields of the Times Aegis times overloaded and collapsed. Solid tungsten slugs, moving at a fraction of the speed of light, tore through the pristine, unarmored hull of the Ascendancy flagship. The beautiful, opulent vessel was ripped apart, secondary explosions blooming like violent, silent flowers in the vacuum of space. "They're crippled!" Thomas yelled, cheering wildly from the back of the bridge. "The dreadnought is dead in the water! The grid is tearing them to pieces!" Arthur didn't celebrate. He kept his eyes fixed on the navigational relay. "Sarah! Spool up the slipspace drives. The grid is going to realize its mistake as soon as the Times Aegis times is destroyed. We need to be gone before it resets." "Drives are hot, Arthur. We can jump on your command," Sarah yelled back. Genevieve looked at the burning wreckage of the Times Aegis. She thought of her father, executed for trying to show mercy. She thought of Dominic, arrogant and cruel in the dust of Outpost 7. And she thought of the entire Veyron Ascendancy, a society built on the backs of the broken. Suddenly realizing that the broken had teeth, she turned to Arthur. His face was bathed in the red light of the tactical consoles, his jaw set, his eyes fierce and unyielding. He was the dirt-born ape she was supposed to be punished with. Instead, he had given her the stars. "Let's go home, Arthur," Genevieve said softly. Arthur smiled, reaching out to grasp her hand. "Initiating jump sequence," he commanded. Outside the viewport, the stars stretched into long, brilliant lines of white light. Space tore open before them, and the 30 rugged, battered, magnificent human ships plunged into the slipspace corridor, vanishing from the Sol system forever. 6 months later, the sky above the colony of New Eden was a brilliant, unpolluted azure blue. Genevieve stood on the wooden porch of their newly built home, a cup of real, earth-grown coffee warming her hands. The air smelled of pine needles and fresh soil. Below the hill, the settlement was thriving. The cargo haulers had been dismantled to build housing, hospitals, and schools. Children ran freely through fields of tall, green grass, their laughter carrying on the wind. There were no collars here. There were no chains of woven light. There was only the dirt, the sky, and the freedom to build a life between them. The sound of heavy boots on wooden planks made her turn. Arthur walked up the steps, wiping grease from his hands with a cloth. He wore his familiar canvas jacket, looking just as rugged and imposing as the day she had first seen him in the toxic dust of Outpost 7. He wrapped his arms around her waist from behind, resting his chin on her shoulder as they looked out over the valley. Thomas says the perimeter sensors are fully operational, Arthur murmured, his deep voice sending a comforting vibration through her chest. If the Ascendancy ever comes looking for us, we'll see them coming a light year away. They won't come, Genevieve said confidently, leaning back into his embrace. The destruction of the Times, Aegis Times, shattered the Sovereign's myth of invincibility. My contacts in the underground say the other subjugated systems are already rising up. The Ascendancy is too busy fighting for its own survival to come looking for ghosts. Arthur turned her gently around to face him. He reached up, tucking a stray lock of hair behind her ear. His fingers were scarred and rough, but his touch was incredibly tender. I never thought I'd see a blue sky again, he said quietly, his eyes searching hers. I never thought I'd have a reason to stop fighting. Genevieve smiled, reaching up to press her hand against his cheek. You didn't stop fighting, Arthur. You just won. He leaned down and kissed her. It wasn't the cold, ceremonial touch of the Ascendancy elite. It was warm, passionate, and entirely human. It was the kiss of a man who had pulled a princess from the sky, not to drag her into the mud, but to build a new world with her by his side. The alien bride, given away as a cruel joke, had found a king in the dirt, and together they had brought an empire to its knees. If you loved this story of rebellion, humanity's indomitable spirit, and an unexpected romance that defied an empire, hit that like button. Share this video with fellow sci-fi fans to help our channel grow, and don't forget to subscribe and ring the bell so you never miss another HFY adventure. What was your favorite twist? Let us know in the comments below. Stay strong, and keep reaching for the stars.
Hi, my name is Tran Trung, the owner and manager of Palace Truths. After watching the video, Alien Bride was forced to marry a human, she never expected him to defy an empire, HFY, I'd really like to know what you think. How did this story make you feel? For me, this story wasn't just about courage, it was about trust growing in the most unexpected place. Watching two people from completely different worlds choose loyalty over fear made the journey feel meaningful. It's a reminder that real strength often comes from standing by someone when it would be easier to walk away. What moment stayed with you the most? Was it Arthur's first act of kindness, or the decision they made together to stand against an empire? Have you ever had someone change your opinion simply through their actions instead of their words? Maybe that's something we can all take into everyday life. Give people the chance to show who they are before judging them. If this story meant something to you, I'd love to read your thoughts in the comments. And if you enjoy HFY stories like this, feel free to like the video or subscribe to Palace Truths for more adventures.